Hi, welcome back to Philosophy 101, Morals in Society at Honolulu Community College. I am Chris Ann Moore. Today, whenever you happen to be watching this, we're going to be talking about existentialism. Now, with existentialism, we are truly moving into a 20th century philosophy. Although existentialism has its roots and actually was begun in the 19th century, it has had enormous influence in the 20th century on art, literature, theater, politics, sociology. Existentialism is, unlike some of the other philosophers we looked at, not one philosophy. Existentialism is actually an umbrella term that refers to the philosophies of many different philosophers, artists, writers. There's no more one existentialism than there is one feminism. Just as if you put a bunch of feminist philosophers in a room, they wouldn't all necessarily agree with each other. Actually, I can guarantee you they wouldn't agree with each other on everything. Existentialist philosophers would not necessarily agree with one another's philosophy. However, all existentialist philosophies share a certain insight and a certain focus. They direct their inquiries in a specific direction. Now, the father of existentialism is Søren Kierkegaard, and tonight we're going to begin with looking at Søren Kierkegaard. He lived from 1813 to 1855. And he is credited with many of the original insights that were later developed by other existentialist philosophers into full-blown philosophies and moral theories, actually. You see, existentialism is different from any of the other philosophies that we've studied, or at least most of the other philosophies that we studied. You learn in philosophy whenever you say any or all or always, you're usually in trouble. Most of the philosophies that we've studied so far have tried to determine what human beings should do. What is the final purpose of human beings? What is the good for human beings? What is the justification for goodness for human beings? And what method can human beings use to determine the objective good? You see, all of these philosophies were attempting to determine an objective moral theory, a moral theory that existed independently of any particular individual's opinions, of any particular cultures, ideas, or traditions, and independent certainly of the needs and desires and requirements of those in power. To find a moral theory that was true for all human beings everywhere for all time. And thus these philosophers ask, what should human beings do? Well, this is one of the fundamental differences that existentialism has with these other philosophies. Because existentialism does not ask, what should human beings do? Existentialism asks, what am I, the existing individual, to do? And this is the essence, really, of existentialism. Existentialism asks, what am I, the existing individual, to do? Not, what should human beings do? But what should I, Chris Ann, do? What should Mary or John or Malia or Kalani do? What should the individual existing person do? That is the essence of existentialism. It deals with the existing individual, not human beings. In fact, existentialism really grows out of a critique of modern values. Now, many people in everyday language, when they say modern, they mean now, what's happening recently. But that's not what the term refers to in philosophy or literature or art. Modern actually refers to the period in the 17th and 18th centuries that that followed the scientific revolution and the rebirth of philosophies. Modern period is the age of reason and the Enlightenment. Postmodern refers to those philosophies that followed after modern values and actually, in a sense, critique modern values. Those values that were put forward in those philosophies of the 17th and 18th century. So, let's look at the definition of modern values. Modern values are those values that were intensified by the Renaissance, Reformation, and scientific revolution and were solidified during the Enlightenment or Age of Reason. You see, those values that we call modern values had always existed to one extent or another, to one degree or another, at different times in history. However, those values that were specifically intensified became of more importance during the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution, and then were solidified in the philosophies of the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, are those values that we refer to as modern values. So modern is not what is happening recently or now. Modern is the 17th and 18th century. Recently, now, philosophy that is of the 20th century is called contemporary philosophy. I'm sure any of you who have gone shopping for furniture realize that there's a difference between contemporary furniture and modern furniture. So existentialism is really born out of a critique of those modern values, a critique of those values that arose in the 17th and 18th century. So in order to understand existentialism, we need to look at some of those values that were solidified in the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason. So let's take a look at some of those values. Modern values. We'll look at what was valued, and then in contrast, what was devalued. If one thing was valued, in general, its opposite was devalued. You see, the Western mind has been involved in a kind of hierarchical dualism since before Plato, but really became entrenched in the Western mind by Plato. You see, Plato had split the one world into two worlds, into a world of becoming and a world of being. That split into two worlds was adopted in the Christian religions as heaven and earth. In both cases, we have the world split in two, and in both cases, one of those worlds was given ultimate value, and the other world was devalued. This is what is referred to when we speak of Platonic hierarchical dualism, a splitting of things into two in which one of the duo is valued and one is devalued. And in modern values, we find the same dualism, the same kind of hierarchical dualism arises out of the Enlightenment in the Age of Reason. For instance, in the Enlightenment and Age of Reason, what was valued was objectivity. What was devalued was the notion of perspective. Now, to understand this, let's think about what objectivity means in this case. We're not talking about objective, as we have through most of this course, meaning independent from any particular individual or culture. Objective also has another meaning. Objective means without prejudice. Objective means neutral. Objective means not to allow one's own feelings, desires, wishes, perspective to interfere with one's evaluation of the data. Objectivity became extremely important in science. It was believed that if scientists evaluated the data, that they must do so from a neutral point of view. They could not let their biases, their prejudices, their hopes, their wishes interfere with their analysis of the data. They must remove all of their own feelings, desires, and wishes and observe the facts neutrally. Therefore, since objectivity was valued, the opposite perspective, the realization that everything I see through my own feelings. I see through my own lens. That I, indeed, just as you are embedded and embodied in a particular moment, a particular location in space. We have a particular location in culture. We have a particular location of gender. We have a particular location of the vast complex of our beliefs, our ideas that we have developed over the experiences of our lives. Everything that we see from a perspective. Not only was that devalued in modern values, it was considered that one could just eliminate one's own perspective and see things neutrally. Postmodern critique of modern values will take that into question, as we'll see. Another thing that was valued was conformity, and what was devalued was difference. Now, we may have to think about this a little bit because we have talked about the rise of individualism in the 17th and 18th century. That Descartes, when he broke away and said that each human being can discover truth using their own individual reason, and when he did not rely on authority, tradition, divine revelation to discover truth, Descartes came to really symbolize the birth of individualism. And yes, that too is a value. But as we move through the 17th and 18th century, there's more and more pressure for everyone to conform to social mores and expectations. And really, those who are considered eccentric, who do not fit into the social mores and expectations, who do not have the right clothes, who do not belong to the right church, who do not have the correct manners, are devalued. Eccentricity, difference, uniqueness actually becomes devalued in the age of individualism. It's a contradiction, but it's nonetheless true. The human mind, human history is often paradoxical. Another thing that was obviously valued in the age of reason was rationality. And what was therefore devalued was emotion and intuition. Actually, we have seen this through the entire philosophical tradition. Truth was to be determined by reason, by the application of logic to a priori ideas or to experience and observation. But it was logic. Human beings were defined by the fact that they could reason. Aristotle called us the rational animal. And so reason was seen to be the road to truth. It was celebrated. It was worshipped almost. But on the other hand, emotion and intuition, the idea that feelings can also reveal truth, that feelings actually inspire us, that feelings drive us forward, that feelings are perhaps essential to our morality, becomes devalued. And so also does this idea of intuition. Therefore, of course, what becomes valued is mind. Descartes located the individual in the mind. His great discovery of the a priori idea was, I think, therefore I am. Therefore, what is human beings? A thinking thing. What am I? A thinking thing. What is my value? My mind. What becomes devalued then is the body. In fact, after the scientific revolution in Descartes, the body was actually imaged as a machine. Descartes had argued that the soul was free, that the mind, therefore, had choice, but the body is a machine that functions according to the laws of physics. In fact, nature, too, is conceived of as a machine that functioned according to the laws of physics. Of course, this conceptualization as mind as having value and free, and body and nature as machine, has had enormous influence in the development of science and the development of medicine, in our approach to nature, in our willingness to exploit nature for profit. Of course, what was also valued and devalued, what was valued, male and female, was devalued. In fact, perhaps this hierarchical dualism that we spoke of Plato's, in which everything is split into a pair of two, in which one is valued and one is devalued, the fundamental dualism of human experience and human nature is the duality of male and female. And in this hierarchical dualism, one must be conceived of as having more value. And in the Western tradition, as we have seen, it has been the male, where the female has been devalued. This is quite a different conceptualization of, for instance, the Tao, where the two forces flow one into the other, they are equal value. Here we have a hierarchical dualism. And of course, if we look at that, objectivity, conformity, rationality, mind are all associated with the male. Descartes had said women were incapable of reason. Aristotle had said women were deformed men. Reason is associated with the male. The mind is associated with the male. Conformity and objectivity, where perspective, difference, emotion, intuition, body, and nature are all associated with females. These are complex symbologies, and they are attached to one another. Of course, we call it Mother Nature, Mother Earth. The female is, of course, more associated with the body. It is the female who breastfeeds, who bleeds, who births. Her association with the body is inextricable, whereas we often find in male conceptualizations and philosophies and religions this desire to transcend the body, either to control the body in asceticism, to deny all sensual impulse, or to let go of the body completely in transcendence, in mystical experience in which the body is no longer present to the consciousness. So, those are some of the modern values. Now, the institutions that became important, essential actually, in the 17th and 18th century were justified by these values. In fact, the values justified the institutions, and the institutions justified the values. There's one more set of values in what was valued and devalued that I'd like us to look at. Male has always been associated with light. The mind and rationality have always been associated with light. We call the Age of Reason the Enlightenment. Transcendent experience is discussed in terms of light. So what becomes devalued? Dark. This is another of those symbolic associations that fit into this iconography, really, of the devalued perspective and emotion, intuition, body, nature, female, and the dark. On the other side, objectivity, conformity, rationality, mind, male, and light. So, what institutions do these values support and justify? Well, a few of them are capitalism, colonialism, slavery, and of course, women as property. Now, this relationship between the modern institutions of capitalism, colonialism, slavery, women as property, and what was valued and devalued in modernity, the 17th and 18th centuries, is actually rather complex and would take some study. Actually, you could spend an entire graduate semester studying it, as actually I did. So you don't need to thoroughly understand all these relationships. That would take a lot more time. But I wanted to touch on modern values and the institutions that arose out of modern values so we could begin to understand existentialism, which is located in a critique of modern values. Postmodernism is a critique of modern values in philosophy. Now, the title, specifically postmodern, actually refers to another kind of philosophy, but existentialism is a postmodern philosophy in that it critiques modern values. Now, one of the primary critiques of existentialism, if we look at existential postmodernism, is the fact that objectivity is a lie. There is no perspectiveless perspective. Modernity valued objectivity. Existentialism said objectivity is a lie. It is an illusion that you can remove your prejudices. It is an illusion that you can remove your feelings. It is an illusion that you can remove your own hopes and wishes and dreams from your evaluation of the facts. As I said before, we are embedded in a particular moment in time, in a particular culture. We are embodied. We are not detached, objective minds. Therefore, all those who claim to the possession of an objective truth are claims to power over. If I say to you, I have the objective truth, what I'm saying is my truth is the truth. And in doing so, I am taking power over you. Anyone who claims that they have the objective truth, that their view of the objective truth is absolutely neutral and they know what is true for everyone everywhere, they are claiming power over. Now, another problem with modernity, existentialism would say, is that it attempts to make rules for human beings. Not only does it make these up claims to objective truth that transcend perspective, which is a lie, but they make rules for human beings. Kant says, make a universal rule. If all human beings do it, you can do it. Rule utilitarianism tells you to make a rule for all human beings. If all human beings can do it, you can do it. But existentialism points out something stunning. Human being does not exist. What is human being? Well, human being is a mental category. It's an abstraction. It's an idea. It's a file cabinet in our minds. Remember long, long ago when I asked you to picture a tree? And I said to you, what did you picture? And you could picture plumerias or coconuts or oaks, but you can't picture tree. You can only picture specific trees. Plumeria, coconuts, coconut palms, Christmas trees. Why? Because tree does not exist. Tree is a mental abstraction. Tree is a form. Well, the same is true of human being. Human being is a mental abstraction, a form. That is the third critique. Human being is an abstraction, a mental category. Guess what then? The rule that this human being should follow is nonsense. What does it matter what human being should do? You can't invite human being for dinner. You can't have a discussion with human being. Human being doesn't have feelings and needs and dreams and passions and goals. Human being doesn't cry at night. Human beings, the specific existing individual, embodied and embedded in a particular moment in history, in a particular culture, gender, race, needs to make decisions. What human being has to do with that is nothing, the existentialists would say. That is the problem with philosophy. Philosophy makes rules for human beings, and human being doesn't exist. Again, philosophy makes rules for non-existent human beings, and therefore, philosophy can't help you, the existentialists would say. Philosophy can't tell you what you should do with your life. Philosophy cannot tell you what your meaning and purpose is. Philosophy cannot tell Chris Ann, in this moment, facing a dilemma, what Chris Ann should do. Philosophy can tell you what human beings should do, but that has nothing to do with me. Know what else? The existentialist philosophers would also say religion can't help you. Why? Religious institutions make rules for non-existent human beings. The same thing. Rules for human beings that don't exist. Now, even religious existentialists, Christian existentialists, which is an entire category of existentialism, would say that religious institutions cannot help you. Because religious institutions are concerned with rules. Interestingly enough, Jesus himself, as the stories go in the gospel, broke the rules of the Jewish tradition again and again. As a matter of fact, that is one of the reasons he so angered the heads of the Jewish religion, because he broke Jewish law. He healed on the Sabbath, for instance. But Jesus said he was not there to fulfill the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. Jesus himself was a rule breaker. What was important, he would say, is in the relationship to the divine. Actually, when Martin Luther broke the Protestant churches for the first time away from the Catholic Church, Martin Luther did so on the basis saying that you don't need all the rules and regulations and sacraments of the Catholic Church. What you need is a personal relationship to the divine, to God. And yet, Luther himself and the Christian churches that have followed have been rule makers. Each has their rules. But what does this have to do about human beings? What the individual is supposed to do? Well, existentialist philosophy would say the rules can't help you. You know what else can't help you according to existentialism? Science cannot provide meaning, purpose, or morality. So science can't help you answer that ultimate question: what am I, the existing individual, to do? What am I to do in this dilemma, in this moment, in this life? Science can't answer that question for you. Science can tell you what you can do, but science cannot tell you what you ought to do, what you should do. Science gave us the ability to use the atomic bomb. It could not tell us whether or not we ought to use it. Science has created agricultural superabundance. We are able to feed everyone in the world. Science cannot give us the inspiration to actually do that. So science cannot answer that question: what am I, the existing individual, to do? So what is one to do? Here you are, needing to to answer that ultimate question. What am I to do? What am I to believe? What is my meaning and purpose? As Kierkegaard would say, what is the idea for which I can live and die? And yet the existentialist philosophers would say, philosophy can't help you, religious institutions can't help you, and science can't help you. So how do you answer that question? Well, you know what a lot of people do? They do just what they did when they were 13 or 14 years old. How does a 13 or 14-year-old answer that question? Who am I? What am I to do? Well, think. What does a 13 or 14 or 15-year-old do when they enter college? How do they find out who they are? Because that is the age, really, when we first begin to be confronted by existential questions of who am I anyway? And they're not easy questions to answer if you take them at all seriously. And if you were anything like me, and I believe you were at 12 or 13, you took yourself very seriously. Most people do at that age. I remember myself getting ready for a party, and I was nervous for some reason. And, I guess I was 11 or 12 years old, and my mother asked me why I was nervous. And then she just used that great line. She said, just be yourself. And I thought, who's that? I probably rolled my eyes and shrugged my shoulder, and most preteens do. But when she left the room, I remember very clearly thinking, be myself. I have no idea who myself is. Myself going to a party at 12 years old, do I want to play spin the bottle and drink beer, or do I want to leave? And I was really lucky. This was some years ago. My biggest existential question was, do I drink beer and play spin the bottle? Today, people are confronted with crack and sex at the age of 12. I would have died of existential anxiety. So how do we answer that question? If philosophy can't help, if religions can't help, if science can't help, well, the 13 or 14-year-old joins the crowd, actually. What happens in high school? You find your identity by joining a group, a clique, a crowd. Now, sometimes you choose your crowd, and sometimes you end up in it by default, but high schoolers identify themselves by the crowd. They're the cheerleaders, or the jocks, or the stoners, or the homeboys. In each and every case, people find a clique to belong to, and they dress like their clique, and they laugh at the jokes their clique laughs at, and they listen to the music that their clique listens to, and they like the people they like, and they don't like the people they don't like. And suddenly an identity is given to you, or at least the image of an identity. And perhaps that's a necessary stage in growing up. Perhaps that is appropriate for someone who is 13 or 14. But what might be appropriate at 13 and 14 is pathetic as one gets older. Because to identify with yourself with a crowd, to find yourself through a crowd, is what the existentialists would call ultimately inauthentic. And so the crowd can't really help you. To look to the crowds or institutions for answers is to be inauthentic. Existentialists demand authenticity. What is authenticity? To be true to yourself. What is it to be inauthentic? To be false, to betray yourself. defining yourself through a crowd or a group or a clique is to betray yourself. Because really, homecoming queen, jock, stoner, geek, hippie, these are not identities. These are not individuals. These are labels. These are two-dimensional magazine-style imaginations of what a human being, not a three-dimensional human being with depth and purpose and feeling. To identify yourself with any institution, with any crowd, to find out who you are is inauthentic. And it is, after a certain age, pathetic. But then you would notice that we're in a quandary. You must answer that question, what am I, the existing individual, to do? You cannot not ask the question. You cannot not answer the question. And yet, how do you find that answer? If philosophy, religious institutions, science can't help you, and to look to the crowd is inauthentic, to look to institutions is unauthentic. Well, the answer to that is where existentialist philosophers really differ. How do I answer that question? What am I to do? Kierkegaard would give one answer. Sartre, another existentialist philosopher, would give another. Nietzsche, another existentialist philosopher, would give yet another. And so we are going to begin to look at some of those answers. We're going to look at the answer that Soren Kierkegaard gave in the 19th century, and then the answer to that question that JeanPaul Sartre gave in the 20th century. Soren Kierkegaard said there was only one way to get the answer, and that was to throw oneself on the will of God, moment by moment, in fear and trembling. Soren Kierkegaard was a Christian existentialist. There have been a long line of brilliant and accomplished Christian existentialist writers and artists, Paul Tillich, Teilhard de Chardin. Kierkegaard began that tradition of Christian existentialism, of saying you can't look to philosophy or science or religious institutions. The rules of religious institutions can't help you. As a matter of fact, Kierkegaard, who was profoundly pious in his own way, was extremely critical of the hypocrisies of the Christian churches of his time, especially as his city in Denmark in the 19th century. Their rule-making, their hypocrisy, their demand for conformity infuriated him. And he looked, how does one have a finite being have a relationship with an infinite God? And how does one answer that question? What am I to do? And Kierkegaard's answer, throw yourself on the will of God in fear and trembling, moment by moment. And then you will find the answer inside yourself. You see, Kierkegaard believed that truth is subjective. Subject, of course, is inside oneself, one's own mind and imagination. By this, Kierkegaard did not mean that there are not objective truths, that there is not such a thing as gravity, which is true and universal and out there, not a matter of my imagination. Kierkegaard did not believed that 2 + 2 = 4, that was an objective truth. When Kierkegaard said truth is subjective, what he meant is that meaningful truths are subjective. The truths that truly matter, the truths that answer the questions of meaning and purpose and morality and destiny can only be found inside. They cannot be found out there. And the only way to find them inside of you is to throw yourself on the will of God. Kierkegaard called this the leap of faith. Kierkegaard's answer, the leap of faith, which means to throw yourself moment by moment in fear and trembling on the will of God. Now, in this course I've talked about before, if you are going to be a philosopher and if you are going to use a divine command theory, you must answer that question, why? How do you know God exists, and how do you know God's will for you? You must provide reasoning. Well, Kierkegaard turns the tables on philosophy, and he says, why would one throw themselves on the will of God? How do you know that God exists? You don't. It's a leap of faith. Why do you do it? Because you have no other choice. Now, to understand what Kierkegaard meant by this, we need to look at Kierkegaard's 3 stages. Kierkegaard said all human beings are at one of 3 moral stages: the aesthetic, the ethical stage, or the religious stage. Now, aesthetic stage is the lowest, the ethical stage is the next, and the religious stage is the last. And for Kierkegaard, human beings move through these stages, although some human beings can stay at a lower stage all their life. Now, the aesthetic stage, where everyone begins, is the stage at which human beings pursue pleasure. They associate pleasure with the good. This is the hedonistic stage. Aesthetic is often used to refer to art, but it also means pleasure. Now, Kierkegaard says those who begin to awaken will find that the aesthetic stage is incredibly disagreeable. It does not bring satisfaction. It does not bring happiness. Now, we have talked about that again and again in this course. The pursuit of desire and the pursuit of pleasure is eventually utterly unsatisfactory. One is constantly waiting for the next thrill, and as soon as they have that thrill, they need the next one. They're chasing moments. And of course, it leads to degeneration and often addiction as well. So one will become completely dissatisfied with the aesthetic stage. Those who do will enter the ethical stage. When they find that their lives have become meaningless, they will attempt to find meaning by ethics. They will attempt to find meaning by being good. This is the stage where one becomes the good little boy or girl. Even the adult who tries to be the good little boy or girl, who tries to follow the rules. You see, how is one to be good? Well, at the ethical stage, individuals look to the rules of the society, what the society defines as the good person, the rules of religious institutions. They will follow the rules of their religion in an attempt to be good, to commit, to do the right thing. But Kierkegaard points out there's a problem with this. You see, rules are for human beings. They're not for the existing individual. Human beings don't exist. There are no rules in institutions or society or in religion that can tell you, should I marry this person or not? Should I follow this career or not? Most of the time, for the things you really answer, there are no rules. And Kierkegaard points out there's another problem. Even when you find those rules, even when there are rules about what you should do and who you should be, Kierkegaard says you will find that you will be unable to live by them. Rules are like New Year's resolutions. How many New Year's resolutions have you made that you have been able to keep? A week, 2 weeks, maybe a month? And the New Year's resolution is forgotten because resolutions like rules are something one tries to impose on oneself from the outside. The only way one can really follow an idea is if it comes from the inside, from inside oneself. So one will find, if they become in the ethical stage and are trying to find the rules, lost looking for the rules, or a hypocrite, unable to follow the rules that they have found. This idea occurs in religion again and again. Paul wrote in the Acts, in his letters, that he could not follow the rules. He needed an internal change of the Holy Spirit, Paul would say. St. Augustine wrote of the same thing. He knew what the good was, but he could not do it. Kierkegaard would say everyone will find the same thing if they truly examine their trying to follow rules. And so this ethical stage, one is ultimately phony. They're fitting themselves into institutions, into society, into churches, like a judge who tries to do everything right, the upstanding citizen. And yet they will ultimately fail. And this failure, this desperation alone is what leads to the religious stage. And for Kierkegaard, the religious stage does not refer to religious institutions. It refers to that leap of faith, that throwing oneself on the will of God. Why? Because there's no other choice. Kierkegaard would say it's like a fire is coming towards you and you are at the edge of a canyon and there's no way you can jump over. that you believe that you can jump over. Rationality will not tell you can jump over. Experience will not tell you can jump over. But in desperation, escape from the fire, you leap and jump and find yourself on the other side. To the answer to the question, how do you know God exists? Kierkegaard would say, you don't. Belief in God is utterly irrational. You cannot create a philosophical argument for that belief. It is internal, it is subjective, and it's a choice made without rationality. It's a choice made from passion, which is what gives it meaning. Kierkegaard would say there's no proof, because with proof there would be no need for faith. And it is faith that makes the choice meaningful. In this way, too, Kierkegaard rejects the philosophical tradition. Now, Kierkegaard's critique of modern values, his postmodern existentialism, the underlying basis of objectivity doesn't exist, that philosophy makes rules for human beings that don't exist, that science cannot help you, that religion makes rules for human beings that don't exist, and to join the crowd, to look to the crowd, to give yourself identity is utterly false, is adopted by other existentialist philosophers in one way or another. These insights form the base of existentialism. Kierkegaard's answer of how to answer the question, what am I, the existing individual, to do? His answer of throw yourself on the will of God is not surprisingly, picked up by future philosophers. So now we're going to move into the 20th century. We're going to look at a 20th century existential philosopher. Because really, in the 20th century, existentialism has an enormous influence, especially after World War II. And our next philosopher is JeanPaul Sartre. And we're going to look at JeanPaul Sartre's existentialism. JeanPaul Sartre lived from 1905 to 1980, very much a man of the 20th century, and extraordinarily important thinker of the 20th century. JeanPaul Sartre is one of those philosophers who was extraordinarily popular and well known in his own lifetime. As a matter of fact, it is said that at JeanPaul's funeral in 1980, over 100,000 people came to Paris. Now, JeanPaul Sartre, like Kierkegaard, was an existentialist. But unlike Kierkegaard, he was not a Christian existentialist. JeanPaul Sartre was an atheistic existentialist. JeanPaul Sartre did not believe God existed. JeanPaul Sartre's particular experiences had led him to conclude that God did not exist. And as a matter of fact, in this conclusion, Sartre really reflected the feelings of an entire generation. No, not the entire generation, of a large portion of an entire generation. You see, JeanPaul Sartre lived through World War II in France. He was born in France when the World War II broke out and the Nazis invaded France. JeanPaul Sartre became a member of the French military and he was captured. He was a POW in Germany. He was eventually released, I think after 9 months. He returned to Paris. And in Paris, he joined the resistance. You see, the Nazis had conquered France and put in the Vichy government. And in Paris, everyone was either a collaborating with the Vichy government, or was resisting. And the underground resistance in Paris was dedicated to a particularly active resistance to the Nazi occupation and dedicated to defeating the Nazis in the war. And many of the existentialist writers of the second part of the 20th century were part of the French resistance in Paris during the war. Albert Camus, Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote The Second Sex and was JeanPaul Sartre's longtime lover. They had met in the resistance. World War II changed many people because the horrors of World War II were unimaginable. It was incomprehensible to people, especially to people who were there, who saw it, who fought in it, who were in the camps, who were POWs, who were in the fields and saw the death. who understood the fire bombings, who saw the atomic bomb dropped. Life changed forever. And for some, philosophy and religion could never be the same. The 20th century is really a century of horrors, and some call it the century of massacres. And it was devastating to many, many people. You see, World War I had been horrific. A global war in which millions have died, in which chemicals were used, in which people died in muddy trenches and foreign fields of poison gases and dysentery, and millions had died. A global war where millions died, incomprehensible at that time. And yet the people who had fought in World War I had believed that they were fighting to end war itself. Those who fought in World War I called World War I the war to end all wars. And they sacrificed their life for that idea. But what happened? A couple of decades later, another world war with more atrocities at an unimaginable scale once again. So far beyond anything that can really be conceived by secular humanism. Any idealistic humanism, any kind of rationality is defied by bombs that kill hundreds of thousands of people in seconds, by gas chambers that are scientifically designed to kill millions of people conveniently, by soap that is made of human fat, by lampshades that are made of human skin. The atrocities of World War II were unbelievable. And JeanPaul Sartre, witnessing these atrocities, came to the conclusion that many people did, that God did not exist. Because JeanPaul Sartre said, either God does not exist or God is not answering. And if God exists and is not answering, his existence is meaningless to us. Not surprising, really, this was the feeling of many of a generation. What surprises me, really, is when I read of those who have been through the camps and the war and the horrors and the atrocities, who came out with faith. There were those, too. There is a wonderful story, actually, of two Jewish men in the camps. One comes upon the other, and the other is praying. And the man asks him, what do you have to pray? What are you praying about? And the man praying says, I'm praying. I'm giving thanksgiving. The man says, we are in a concentration camp. What do you have to give thanksgiving about? The other man says, I'm giving thanks that I am not like them. So some people were able to hold on to their faith, but many, many, many others were not. And JeanPaul Sartre was one of these. The atheist existential philosophers of the second half of the 20th century rejected the idea that God existed. But JeanPaul Sartre was adamant in his writings that one cannot just easily reject the existence of God. One cannot do it as if it were a simple calculation. You see, many people say, I'm an atheist, as if it doesn't mean anything, as if it's unimportant. JeanPaul Sartre says one must confront what it means to say God does not exist. One must face what that means, what logically follows if one says that God does not exist. You see, those of you who do have faith, I have throughout this course said, you must say why you accept a divine command theory. You must say how you believe you know God's will. Well, for those of you who don't believe in a divine, who don't believe in God, you must also say why, and you must face the consequences of not believing in a divine being. In terms of your philosophy, in terms of your morality, in terms of your meaning and purpose of your life, in terms of how you are going to live the best of all possible lives. Now, Sartre would say, God does not exist. And if God does not exist, there is no objective morality, because there is no one there to think it. If God does not exist, there is no reason why one should not lie, why one should not steal, why one should not murder. There is no such thing as morality that is true for all human beings at all times, everywhere. So, Sartre calls this forlornness, this insight forlornness. Forlornness is Sartre's insight that God does not exist. And therefore, not only does an objective good not exist, there is no meaning and purpose to life. And there is no objective morality to look to for answers. You see, there is no defined meaning and purpose of life. You don't have any destiny that you might follow. You are not fated because there is nothing to give you a destiny. There is nothing to assign you a fate. There is nothing to determine what your meaning and purpose might be. And therefore, you are totally free. There is no logical reason why you should make one choice over another. There is nothing to demand that you take one path rather than another. Sartre is famous for quoting Dostoevsky and saying, if God does not exist, everything would be possible. Paraphrasing Dostoevsky, actually. If God does not exist, everything is possible. Well, Sartre answers, everything is possible. But this is not necessarily comfortable. Sartre goes forward to say that, in fact, we are condemned to be free. What does that mean? Well, first of all, we must choose. We cannot not choose. Because, of course, even if you just have a decision to make and you don't make it, that in itself is a decision, as the philosopher William James once said. You must choose. And you can choose anything. You are condemned to be free. And so, Sartre said, you must face that freedom. You must face that you exist in a world without objective morality, without meaning and purpose, without anything to guide you, without anything to tell you what choices you should make. And that you live and you die and it's over. Sartre forces human beings to look at the existential abyss, to existential emptiness, no meaning, no purpose, no morality, no God, nothing but complete freedom. So, what do we do? Well, how do we judge morality? How do we know what is good? Sartre's answer, of course, is there is no objective morality, so we cannot judge the morality of any action. So what do? How do you answer that question? What do I, the existing individual, do? Sartre says invent, create. You can do whatever you want. You have no destiny, no fate, no purpose, nothing but freedom. So invent yourself, create yourself. Who creates you? You see, Sartre would say that since you are free, and since you must make choices, you must realize that it logically follows that you create yourself. There is no essence for you to fulfill, no who am I that I can find inside myself somewhere, no answer to my mother's just be yourself. There is no self. See, for Sartre, existence precedes essence. In other words, I exist, and then by my choices, I create who I am. I create my essence. It is as if I am this clay, unformed. And my greatest artwork, my only artwork, is myself. I create me. And how do I do this? Through my choices, through my actions, through what I actually do. It is like my actions are the hammer and the chisel out of which I carve who I am. But, Sartre said, since you create yourself, you must face. If you are to be authentic, you must face the consequences of your choices. You must face the reality of your freedom and therefore the reality of your complete responsibility for your choices. You see, with each action you are creating yourself. Therefore you have to ask, Is this who I want to be? And then you must realize you have complete responsibility for that choice. You made it freely, therefore you are utterly responsible. So you must ask yourself, if you are going to be authentic, am I willing to take responsibility? And finally, Sartre would say, you must ask yourself if this is the world you want to create. Now you might say, wait a second, what do you mean, the world I want to create? I thought I was creating me. Well, since human beings, each individual human being, does not have a meaning or a purpose or a destiny, and is also utterly free, who decides what human beings should do? Who decides what a human being is? You do, by your actions. You see, as you create yourself, you create an example. And in that example, you are saying what you think other human beings should do, what other human beings, in fact, are. We've run out of time. We'll talk about this a little bit more next time. In the meantime, read your chapters. Bye-bye.